this evening, in person and online. I'm glad you're able to join us. We are going to keep up with our normal agenda on Sunday nights in that we will spend some time in review and question and answer about this morning, and then we'll move on to our Bible study. This morning we looked at the fourth commandment that is recorded in Exodus 20, and particularly in verses 8 through 11 there. And I gave four reasons why I wanted to do, why I was going to take a little extra time on this one. And just to be brief, I think this particular commandment has more going on there than initially meets the eye. It's a point of controversy when you get into the Gospels between Jesus and his detractors. Number three, there has been various different Christian approaches to what to do with this gospel, and you know, it seems like particularly Protestants and Protestant nations have a hard time figuring out what to do with this. To be honest, I'm probably not going to go down that road almost at all as far as the legal force of it. I'm willing to entertain questions about it, but that probably won't show up in any sermon. And my fourth reason for spending time on this is because I think this particular commandment has more difficulty as we transition from the Old Testament to the New. Nobody's really trying to figure out what do not murder in the Old and the New Testament. You know, it just seems pretty straightforward. Yet the Sabbath commandment doesn't enjoy that kind of understanding. And from that, I went on to deal with language issues, and I basically wanted to introduce two Hebrew words. One was Shabbat, and the other was Nakah, and they both have to do with rest and the Sabbath. And I think in that the most significant aspect is the fact that what normally gets translated as rest. I'm not necessarily against that word, but it doesn't mean to stop and relax. And I think we kind of think that. I mean, that's the vision of the weekend once we finish with our work week and all that kind of stuff. But I think we can mix up some stuff in there. And then, we're not talking about resting like taking a nap, but the idea of establishing a place and then inhabiting and using that place for what it was designed for, to cease from work and enjoy living in the space. And so if you get that, to me, that makes a whole world of difference as you look at Genesis 2, 1 through 3, is what is God actually doing when he rests? Because it makes no sense that somebody doesn't lose energy or need energy rest, you know. And so I think our definition helps us with that. I also wanted to just point out that in Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 5, there are other versions or other statements of this fourth commandment. And the one I focused on was Deuteronomy. And the reason is because the Exodus and the Deuteronomy passages give the definition of why. They give a reason. And Leviticus doesn't really give a reason. And in Exodus, the reason is more Godward. We are to be like God. As he rested on after creation, we are to rest after 6 days of work. In Deuteronomy, it's not that way. It's not as Godward focused, it's more manward focused, and the idea is because you came out of slavery, we're not going to have oppression in God's kingdom. And one of the ways to keep that oppression out is by establishing a stoppage to the work. And so I mentioned some other things that are good about this, that I put a quote up there that recognizes God. In establishing the Sabbath, said, I'm going to be the one who is Lord over not just the calendar, but when you think of other aspects of Sabbath, he's the Lord who's going to stop you from overworking and forgetting about him once a week, but also in the year of release, he's going to release all the slaves, release all the debt, and that gets canceled, and let the land have a rest as well. And then on the 50th year, the land not only gets a rest, it reverts back to its original owners. And so all of these things help us to recognize God's lordship over everything. If you think about that, that's economics in the land and all that other stuff as well. I gave a few points about how the culture ought to be drastically changed by these ideas of Sabbath, and I gave a few reasons for that. I also gave a picture of what it meant to have a blessed life in the Sabbath. Both of those passages I used were from Isaiah. One was for everybody in general, and one focused on the eunuch and the foreigner who lived there. And both of those, the reason I put those in there is to give a vision of what the Sabbath looked like when it's working well. Now, anybody who spent any time reading the Old Testament knows that it didn't work well often. And there was a great disobedience in that way. But I didn't dwell on that, not that it wasn't there, but I'm just saving that one. The other thing I did after that was go to Genesis 2. We looked at the original statement of God creating 6 days and then resting one because his work was complete. That day gets blessed and set aside in a way, it's sanctified in a way that the other 6 weren't. And we thought about what it meant for God to work and God to rest. Obviously, no moving of energy there. Then he goes and he puts, using the same word, he puts Adam in the garden to occupy it the same way he occupied the world. The creation. He puts Adam in the garden. Adam is blessed. He has responsibilities. He also doesn't have the drudgery of work, but he fails, as we know. And he not only has a fight between him and the ground, he is exiled from the garden in which he could live forever in that state. God didn't want him to live in that state forever, so he pushes him out of the garden, almost like you would push cattle out of the garden. And that is the state of mankind, not just that one man, but mankind. And Jesus comes and offers rest in Matthew 11. And I tried to make the connection that what Christ offers is just what we need post-fall, and that it's the goodness of God sometimes that drives you towards God, or at least it ought to drive us towards God. So that is a fly-through over what we talked about this morning. I would say this: I've had a couple of conversations with people, and I want to stick with my points, but I also want to clarify. When I was talking about the covenant in the Old Testament and calling it circumcision, and mentioned a couple of drawbacks about circumcision, that it can't be seen, it's only for males. There's a couple other, but the weakness of, and I was focused on the inability to see it, and yet the Sabbath you could see, right? And that was my point, that it was a visible understanding of how you dealt with God, how you approach God, and all. But to be more precise, the covenant of circumcision is with Abraham, not part of it predates the Mosaic covenant, so it's incorporated in it. In other words, the same group of people are still experiencing that, but it's not the sign of the Mosaic covenant. The actual keeping of the Sabbath is. And so I blended and convoluted and probably confused those two covenants in somebody's mind, I'm sure. And so just to keep it straight, the covenant with Abraham is marked by circumcision. The covenant with Moses is marked by Sabbath. Okay, but I would argue my two main points remain: that the Sabbath is visible, the circumcision isn't. Yeah. Is there any other thoughts or questions or comments that you would like to make? I feel like I flew through a lot of material, and there are a lot of little nooks and crannies we could dive into. And they probably won't get addressed as I'm preaching, even over the next week or maybe 2 weeks. So if you want to have those kind of conversations, this is the place to do it, but you don't have to. Jay?
Pastor, as a reminder of Luther's hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. It's in the second stanza, he has this phrase: "Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing, does ask who that may be. Christ Jesus it is he, Lord Sabaoth is his name. From age to age the same, and he must win the battle." And I, from my understanding of just reading that history of where he was inspired, it's from Psalm 46, which basically is God is fighting for us, has won the fight and is fighting for us. And the idea is we are in Him, and He's fighting our battle. And when we go back in this idea of Him being the Sabbath, and elsewhere in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, He's the Lord of the Sabbath. Is quoted. The question, the thing that I was sort of thinking through was, when we think of the Sabbath as sort of resting, or at least in a play, the two words that you use, one was resting from work, and the other one was orienting in a way that's positioning, and resident was the word. Is there a risk of thinking of differentiating sacred versus secular, and in a way that is sort of, I'm not even sure if I'm asking.
My answer is really poor. I don't know. I never thought of that before. Maybe you could tease that out a little bit, because I'm not sure how that danger would look.
So if we take one sense of the word, which is sort of rest, as the Lord resting from His work, as opposed to the other word, the other Hebrew word you use, which is sort of He's resident. It seems to me both are conditioned to, basically, I'm thinking of it as a general or a special revelation, where the idea is basically that the Lord is calling us to think of Him as the source of our strength, as Him being our strength. And it seems that when we get into the Seventh-day Adventist or the Presbyterian debates, it seems that there's a fundamental tension that's coming from a division of sacred versus secular, whereas the Lord is actually calling, in taking the verse that the way you explained it, it's like all of it is sacred. It's not the 6 days and the 7th day, 6 years and the 7th year, the 48 years and the 49th year. Like it's not a time thing. It's the Lord is the Sabbath.
Right.
And that's what even Luther is attesting to, or in his stanza. And it seems like the division that's coming in the church seems to come from the time element becoming the centrality, whereas Luther or all the passages are pointing to the Lord is the Sabbath.
Right.
He's our ultimate rest, and our strength and everything comes from Him.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So, kind of a little bit of what Jay's talking about. So, I thought you might get into this morning a little bit about, okay, so the Sabbath, so you have, so the Lord is the focus of the Sabbath. And so, resting is not, I grew up in a Sabbatarian home, so, there's no cooking, no ironing, no anything on Sunday. Everybody took a nap in the afternoon. I mean, it was physical rest from doing those type of things. But that almost looks at it as obviously Sabbath is for man. So that kind of gets to the man side of things, but I guess what I'm thinking about in reference to what you said this morning is the Sabbath is a holy occupation. I thought you were going to maybe get into more about, so if it's not physical rest that I'm focusing on, then there is something about the Sabbath that I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
So there's a holy occupation.
Right.
And the holy occupation is going to the temple, being involved in the sacrifices, a holy. You kind of glazed over when you said holy convocation, but you didn't tease out what a holy convocation is. But on the Sabbath, you participate in this holy convocation.
Right.
That you don't, Monday, day 1 through day 6, there's no holy convocation.
Right.
But on the Sabbath, there is a holy convocation.
Right.
So there is this super emphasis on a holy occupation on the Sabbath day.
Yeah.
That kind of we can benefit from understanding Sunday in that way.
Yes.
This is a holy convocation. It's something a little bit different than what we do in the other 6 days. It's preoccupied with the Lord. And I think that the idea of the Lord's Day gets to that idea.
It does.
That the Holy Convocation, this is the Lord's Day.
Right.
And so on Sunday, it's not that we become preoccupied with God for the first time in the week, but
Right.
there's a super occupation with
Right.
God that we're freed up to do because all of our other labors are put aside.
Right.
And we can have a holy convocation
Yeah.
on the Lord's Day.
Yeah, I think that gets, I think that Isaiah passage that I read gets to that where it talks about, quit worrying about your own stuff, quit worrying about your own words, and this is the day that you're paying attention to God's words, you're paying attention to God's interests in ways that you haven't been throughout the week. And it's the idea that 1 through 6, you're focused on what you have to be focused on, not that those days are not dedicated to God. But on the seventh day, this is the day in which we don't rest in the sense of taking a break and watching the NFL. We take a break from what we've been doing so we can listen and pay attention and focus on God. And so it's not just a putting down of something, it's a picking up of something in a more intense fashion. And to just do something different than what you've been doing 1 through 6 is not the point. You put down 1 through 6 to the picking up of what you're doing with, and listening to God. And some of that, no doubt, is spent in a formal company of worship, but it doesn't end there as well. And so the idea that if you go back to kind of compare this to God's week, God is establishing the universe and then occupying it. We're doing the same thing. We're establishing things during the week, but then on Sunday we get to really occupy and be what we're made to be, and that is followers and faithful people to God who are worshiping Him and paying attention to Him, putting down our own distractions and our own self-interest and our own, even the part that got me is stop listening, paying attention to your own words and pay attention to His, and so that is the coming in and enjoying what you've been trying to build all week. What have you been trying to build all week? Why have you been striving all week? Well, it's so that you can put that down for a while and enjoying God in a more deeper fashion.
And you have to think about, okay, so you went back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2. So what was going on day 7? Well, if God is creating each of these days and saying it's good and very good, on day 7, the heavenly hosts are preoccupied with God's accomplishment.
Yeah.
So day 7 was really God giving creation an opportunity to focus on
Right.
Him. Now that He's done everything,
Right.
He sits
Right.
back and receives all of the
Right.
all the adoration and glory.
Yeah.
So day 7 is the day that
Right.
that God is the preeminent focus.
Exactly. Yep. Let me go with you and then you, bro. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, I think one of the, I would say, drawbacks is that sometimes we take the word rest here in this context literally.
Yeah.
Now,
I know I have.
worship, when the seventh day that we are supposed to worship God, worship is not resting. Worship is literally physical. We are working.
It's an activity.
What are we working for? And who are we working for?
Holy activity.
Yeah.
The holy activity.
Yeah.
So rest here, if we look at rest as not say, sleeping, but resting in the arms of God.
Right.
So our resting is really focusing
Right.
on Him.
Right. And to me, all of this discussion ought to just be priming you for Hebrews discussion on rest. I mean, it ought to be sort of like, just like knocking on your head. Let me go, Bill, and then to Jay.
I think as I'm sitting here, that's what we're doing now. Is I believe we're doing what that activity. There are many churches. That service is done at 12 o'clock. That's it. There's no evening service. There's many churches are like that. Where here, we have the Sunday school, morning worship service, and then an evening service that goes back to the sermon in the morning, but then once that's done, there's a Bible study where it's throughout the whole day. We are bathed in the Word.
Right.
We prayer. So I think, and again, I think that churches that don't do that, I think they're missing out. And it just hit me.
Right.
We're doing. I mean, even with a wand in the back right now.
Yeah.
Okay, those children are being bathed in the Word, prayed over, exchanging. The leaders back there are dealing with situations where they can teach and show the Word practically to them, what it really means, what love truly means, what obedience means. To me, that's, I believe, we are doing. Now, I'll be interested to know, beyond that, what are other things that would actually manifest.
Right. Thank you, Bill. Jay?
Yeah, just going back to the comment I was making earlier, Pastor, is that I think what those verses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew 12, or even what Luther was pointing to, is that it's akin to sort of general versus special revelation. In that, if the Lord is the Lord of the Sabbath, the Lord is the Sabbath. If we see all of life as sacred, and I love the word convocation, like you're looking at that in that particular day in a special way to the Lord, but all the whole week is the Lord's.
Right.
But if we start with a time element or a place element divorced from the Lord of the Sabbath, then we end up with cults, like Seventh-day Adventist cults, essentially. If we see what our rendition is or our work is on, like if you separate the day from who the Lord of that day is.
Yeah, that's a problem. And quite frankly, those passages you're pointing to in the gospel, that is the problem of that day in Jesus' time, is there's a separation of understanding what this was for versus what they were trying to enforce.
And to Peter's, I don't know, Peter or Paul's, where it's talking about liberty, like some people call some days special, and some people, like it's a personal conviction thing. Would you, and not necessarily like if you're not specific, like you could go. How far do you go in that? Is what your challenge.
I'm going to bring up another subject here just for you guys to think through. Not that I'm trying to necessarily extend this part, but we often say that we want people to get married, and marriage is a good thing, and it's not just a Christian thing; it's a human thing, and so we're for people getting married, in all kinds of backgrounds and from all kinds of situations, and that it is a basic building block of God's governance over man, okay? And so people ought to have that. And one of the things we do is we point to that the early picture of marriage in Genesis 2 and see that it's tied to the creation, and it's not a part of the fall. It suffers from the fall, but it's not part of fall. It's not post-fall, but it's one of the institutions, one of the aspects that God establishes there. Well, I think the same argument has to be made for human beings in general when it comes to the Sabbath. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I can impose the Sabbath on anybody, no more than I can impose marriage on anybody, really. But the idea is that based the points that are made, particularly in Deuteronomy 5, about human oppression and things like that, and oppressing not only others but yourself with work and things like that, that you can make a pretty strong argument, I think, that this is a creation ideal that is good for all human beings to live under, and that you should have a cessation of work even if you can't bring yourself to recognize that it's God who's blessing you, you still as a human being ought to have a cessation of work in which you and your animals and everybody around you can stop. And so, this is definitely a covenantal idea, but we have to recognize that it's also a creational idea.
And it's an idea that transcends economics. Because some people could say that in our environment where we have a social safety net, the idea of working every single day to eat is something we don't understand the struggles that other environments have. But when you think about what was going on in Israel, that directive regarding the word being ceased applied to everybody whether they were poor or not.
Right.
And even they had to rest too.
Right.
And it was in Israel, it was a global reality.
Right.
Everybody was
Right.
and so I think you can rightfully argue that this is not an economic issue.
Right.
It is human well-being
Right.
demands some type of cessation of work. And although it's not the main emphasis in the Sabbath, it is an emphasis.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, I don't know what the reasoning behind it was, though Chick-fil-A. This is multi-billion-dollar corporation where I'm sure there's extraordinary pressure, even probably from the board, say, hey, we can make more money. And whatever caused that decision, okay, that, and I'm sure the world looks at that, these people are crazy. They're not
Yeah.
doing this.
Right.
You know, and yet, to this day, to this moment, they say no. And there were
They're doing all right.
franchises that tried to.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
again, it's, but I see the point about where
Yeah.
God gives something, and that it's for our protection, where we bump against it and say, we got a better.
Right. Yeah. You guys bring up an interesting point. I've often, well, not often, I have thought what this would play out in other societies. It's very easy for a rich society to say, we're not going to work tomorrow or something. But how does this play out in other places? It would be interesting. And also that as do all the commandments, to what extent do you impose this on somebody? Well, in Israel, they imposed it on everybody. They shut it all down. Now, you can shut down the ability to go to work. In other words, you can't clock into Chick-fil-A today. Chick-fil-A's made that impossible. But that doesn't necessarily mean those people are either resting by anybody else's standards, nor are they turning to God to appreciate, there's no spiritual rest there at all either. And so, and I think that's exactly what foreigners faced in Israel. Like, okay, everything's shut down. I guess I'm staying home today, but because I don't have a choice, not because I'm actually enjoying the benefits of what this covenant is providing and the God of this covenant is offering. And so, I think it's interesting as you try to incorporate this into your society and treat it like laws, that's where you end up in some convoluted places sometimes. Yep. Any other comments or thoughts? Yes, up top.
A question online, it says, this lesson reminds me of Luke 16 that says, make friends for eternity with worldly mammon. What is your view on this?
What's my view on that?
Yeah, hang on.
Yeah, I think that it's absolutely true. I mean, you got to end up pro that verse, don't you? So I'm not going to come against it, but you know, we have. It's interesting to be in Christendom in that we have knowledge about other people that they don't have about themselves sometimes. And I'm thinking about one of the ladies who prays on Wednesday night. She's praying for her cousins, or no, not her cousins, her nephews. And she's praying things on them that she wants them to be wise and beneficial and make better choices about things they don't really value the way they should. In other words, she knows better for them than they know for themselves, and she's asking us to pray in that direction for her nephews. And so we have a friendship not just with the world, but for the world. And it goes even beyond gospel. It goes to things like, you know, we understand who you are as a human better than you understand who you are as a human because Scripture's told us. And so that's why we want to be informative and friendly and on the ability to influence people both with the gospel and for righteousness and even for their own benefit.
I think one of the things they might have been saying with that question was, your bent in the morning's message was that,
May I interrupt? I think I asked the wrong question.
Does that mean my answer was bad too?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so to clarify, I'm sorry, the actual question was, if the Sabbath is a creation idea, why didn't Scripture give a clear and precise command like they gave us the fourth commandment to change to the Lord's Day? If the Sabbath is a creation idea.
If the Sabbath is a creation idea.
Why didn't Scripture give a clear and precise command, just like He, that is God, gave us the fourth commandment to change to the Lord's Day?
So why, when you look at the New Testament, don't we see a clear command to change to the Lord's Day?
Yeah, I think that's the essence.
Did you want to address? Yeah, you want to go ahead.
so what you have in the New Testament is escalation.
Yeah.
So the Sabbatarian concept gets escalated in the New Testament beyond this world to heavenly rest, which is the point. You're going to eventually end up in Hebrews. This is the point of the author of Hebrews. There still is a rest. Well, that's a Sabbath rest. In fact, he says there's a Sabbath rest. I mean, if you do some searches for a Sabbath, you're going to find in Hebrews this is a Sabbath rest. So the New Testament does address the Sabbath,
Right.
but it doesn't address it as a covenantal issue in the same way that it's a covenantal issue for the Mosaic Covenant. So it's in the New Testament, but it's gotten much more aggressive, I guess. I don't know. I'm looking for a word. It's gone beyond what the Old Testament. I mean, the Old Testament is chump change in comparison with what the New Testament concept of Sabbath rest is.
Yeah, one of the things that the Sabbath is, the picture of the Sabbath is really interesting because you typically think about it as laid down by Moses. And then obviously when you switch gears from the Old Covenant under Moses to the New Covenant under Christ, and you look through the New Testament, you don't see a repetition of that fourth commandment. Therefore, you drop it out. At least that's how some people think about it. And so that practice of Sabbath stays within the Mosaic covenant. What it fails to recognize is this thing started before the Mosaic covenant, and it ends way after the Mosaic covenant, and it never ends, actually. And so the Mosaic covenant catches a picture of it, and it defines it, but it's much, much bigger than the covenant. And even when you see what God does in 3 verses of chapter 2 of Genesis, those 3 verses, that's a seed.
mean, we have to stop trying to Judaize ourselves, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and the one of the issues about this is, and I think you see this come out in the Gospels, and it's definitely talked about in that verse you mentioned, is the idea of setting down stipulations by which you judge someone else. And though this is law, you know, one of the things I tried to picture this morning is that this is extremely beneficial and desirable should you live this out the way it's designed. And so hopefully it doesn't come to a matter of law in which you're inflicting punishment on somebody for that. But one of the problems Jesus encounters is that all it is law for the Pharisees. That's it. And there's no life in it. There's no blessing in it. And you know, they've completely. Well, you understand. I mean, Jesus's complaints against the Pharisees are long and deep, but primarily when it comes to the Sabbath, they have sucked the life out of it. They've sucked the blessing out of it, and all that remains is the stipulation.
Side of the thing. And then when Jesus was very, you know, they did it according to the customs and stopped working on the Sabbath, and they were never reprimanded for it. So there's freedom in that you can practice it as the Lord is ultimately the Lord of the Sabbath.
Right.
And yes, it's good to rest. It is good, but it is not, if someone is not doing or not doing based on their conviction, we are not to pass judgment on. Is that fair?
The other thing that Jesus has a problem with is there's no nuance in this at all. You know, he literally gets upbraided for healing a man's hand on the Sabbath. Okay, and he points out, look, if your animal fell in a hole, you would for sure go get that animal out of the hole, but you don't want this, you know. The guy literally says, you can do this during the weekdays. Are you kidding me? You know, and this is to one extreme that this whole thing has gone. And Jesus, when he talks about David eating the bread that was consecrated, everything like that, there is law, but there's also nuance to the law and the application of the law, in which you have to recognize that law must get applied in situations that require wisdom.
So we can say that Christians who equate the Sabbath with the Lord's Day are confused and not understanding that the Sabbath and the Christians are having.
Yeah. I think there's some confusion on a couple points. Number one, there's some language confusion. You know, the Sabbath day is a different thing by name than the Lord's Day. And so they're convoluting some words there. And if that were all it was, it's just some straightening out of vocabulary. As it is with some people, then let's just straighten out our vocabulary a little bit. But for some people, it's deeper than that. And I mean, you know, it gets very deep for certain strands of Christianity in which you try to keep Sabbath law on a Sunday in some way, and not only keep it but impose it on others as well, and make that a point not just of sanctification but justification eventually, and that of course turns this into a cult of some kind, and so it can get really bad, and so what we have to say is that I think we have to maintain the idea of the rest being focused on God and what he does and how he rests and how Jesus provides that rest rather than the imitation of Mosaic stipulations. Yeah. No. Yes, up top.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I'm not saying that we shouldn't rest. I'm just saying that, as even as Jesus said, the Sabbath's made for man, not man for the.
Yeah, and that quote of the Sabbath being made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Not man for the Sabbath. We shouldn't put it as like a legalistic.
Well, and that's my point, that law needs to have nuance as it's applied. that there are several things that are important, and I'm certainly a law is important, but the law that is supposed to create human thriving, that is then turned around and maintains the crippled nature of a human, is not understanding what the law is there for. And so you know, again, the laws, the Sabbath is for man, not man for the Sabbath. That particular Pharisee is turning this around for a tool of cruelty that was supposed to give life. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Well, we'll hit this again next week. Let me ask you this before I close that down. If you had to preach next week, what are the subjects you would want to make sure that were covered because I didn't either do a good enough effort or ran out of time or didn't touch on it? What are some gaping holes that you see that this guy better cover them or he hasn't covered this subject? Or questions that need to be answered? I'm interested in what you think is still necessary on this subject from where you sit. Yes, Jay.
No, it's not. I would be very curious about your exposition on Hebrews, Pastor, about the eternal Sabbath being eternal.
Okay.
I'm very eager to hear.
Yes. Yes, if I ignore Hebrews, that's a big problem. Yes. Yes. Anything else? Larry? How did the Jews miss it? That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think they saw rest as coming from a person, first of all. I think they saw, not to answer the question now exactly, but I think they saw it as kind of a vending machine thing. If I keep the Sabbath, I'll get the blessing. And God as a person or a deliverer was not really too much in the picture, I would say. But yeah, the problem, the Jewish problem, which how they missed it, is a good question. Somebody had their hand up there.
Yeah, this wasn't one for me. This was one that I guess someone who I won't name was mentioning, that that the Lord's return, from their perspective, will be the ultimate Sabbath.
I would say he establishes the ultimate Sabbath in that he introduces, well, I'm looking at the big picture of his return, when he sums everything up. You know, that when he returns, there's a lot of things that happen. But as he sums things up, he introduces the final ultimate concept of rest and the experience of rest for those who follow him. Yeah. But again, when I say rest, I'm not talking about a nap in heaven. You know, I'm talking about taking up residency to do what we're supposed to do, okay? And so I'm not talking about you getting a good night's sleep on a fluffy cloud or something like that. Those are kind of Renaissance pictures of heaven. They're not real pictures of heaven, okay? All right. Okay. Well, I want to pray and then change sort of